It's a moonless night in the year 1120, and a peasant is kneeling over a dead deer in the king's forest, his hands red to the wrist. He didn't want to be here. His children haven't tasted meat in months, and the forest is full of it. Deer everywhere, more than the king could ever eat. But that deer isn't food. It's the king's property. And under the king's law, a commoner caught kneeling here with blood on his hands could lose those hands, or his eyes, or his life, all for a piece of meat that was grazing 10 feet from his home. This is the strangest truth about medieval food. The meat was everywhere, and almost none of it was allowed to be yours. Here's the picture in your head, and it's wrong. The medieval peasant tearing into a giant roast leg of something, grease down his chin, a feast on a wooden table. Movies love that image. The reality is almost the reverse. For most peasants, most of the time, meat was rare, and which meat you ate said everything about exactly where you stood in the world. Because in the Middle Ages, meat wasn't just food. It was a map of power drawn in flesh. And to read it, you have to start with the animals a peasant was actually allowed to touch. The one animal that was truly his was the pig. A pig was perfect for a peasant. It fed itself in the woods on acorns and scraps. It cost almost nothing to keep, and in late autumn it became a winter's worth of food. But a pig wasn't something you ate casually. It was an event, killed once a year, and then stretched as far as it could possibly go. Beyond the pig, a peasant's meat was small and scrappy. Chickens kept more for their eggs than their bodies. A few doves from a dovecote, if the Lord allowed one. Eels and fish from the rivers and ponds. And here's the thing most people get wrong. For a lot of peasants, the main source of animal protein wasn't meat at all. It was dairy. Milk, butter, and especially cheese were so central to the poor diet that they had a name, the white meats of the poor. When archaeologists from the University of Bristol chemically analyzed the food residues soaked into pottery from a medieval village at West Cotton in Northamptonshire, published in 2019, that's exactly what they found. A diet built on dairy, grains, and vegetables, with actual meat as an occasional guest, not the main event. The peasant wasn't gnawing a turkey leg. He was living on cheese and pottage and dreaming about the pig. And here's the part that turns your stomach a little. When a peasant did eat meat, he ate all of it, every part. Nothing your grandmother would recognize as a nice cut. The blood was caught and cooked into pudding. The intestines were cleaned and stuffed. The feet, the ears, the snout, the tongue, the lungs, the head, all of it went into the pot, because wasting any of it was a luxury the poor could not afford. There's even a dish that gives us a phrase we still use. The organs of a deer, the heart, liver, and entrails, were called the umbles. A servant or a poorer household might be given a pie made of them. Umble pie. Eat humble pie, and you're repeating a medieval insult about being fed the leftover guts while the rich got the good meat. So the peasant ate the animal from nose to tail, not out of some modern idea of sustainability, but because he had no other choice. Which raises the obvious question. Where was all the good meat going? Because it was going somewhere. It was going to the people who owned the land and the animals on it, and increasingly, the law itself. Because the best meat in the medieval world, venison, the meat of the deer, was almost never something a peasant could legally eat. When William the Conqueror took England in 1066, he brought an idea that would shape the countryside for centuries. He declared vast stretches of land to be royal forest. And forest didn't mean woodland. It meant a legal zone where the deer and the boar belonged to the king, protected for the king's hunt. At its height in the 13th century, royal forest covered more than a quarter of England, in some places entire counties, and the animals themselves were ranked like everything else. There were the beasts of the forest, the red deer, the boar, reserved for the king and the greatest nobles. Below them, the beasts of warren, the hare, the rabbit, the pheasant, the partridge, which lesser lords might be granted the right to hunt. Even individual birds carried rank. A swan was royal. You did not eat a swan unless you were somebody. The whole animal kingdom had been sorted into a hierarchy of who was allowed to put it in their mouth. And the peasant sat at the very bottom of it, legally entitled to almost nothing with 4 legs. Meanwhile, at the Lord's table, the same event looked like another planet. A great household feast wasn't about hunger any more than a peasant's pig was about sport. It was theater. Roasted swan, sometimes redressed in its own feathers to look alive again on the platter. Peacock served the same way. Whole roasted boar, venison in every form, birds stuffed inside other birds. Course after course, far more than anyone could eat, because the point was never just to feed people. The point was to show, in meat, exactly how far above everyone else you sat. The peasant boiled a pig's foot and called it a good week. The Lord served a swan in its own plumage and called it a Tuesday. Same country, same year, 2 completely different worlds, and the border between them was drawn in flesh. So what happened if a peasant crossed that border? If his children were starving and he took the deer, the law had 3 ways to catch you, and their names are chillingly specific. Dog draw, caught tracking a wounded deer with a hound. Back bear, bear, caught carrying the dead animal away on your back, and bloody hand, caught in the forest with your hands still red from the kill, caught red-handed. That phrase, the one you still use for anyone caught in the act, comes straight from a poacher kneeling in the king's forest with blood on his hands. And we have their names. In 1334, the Forest Court of Sherwood recorded a group of men, Hugh of Wothale, William Hind, a man called Wilcock, and Stephen Fleming of Nottingham, caught after they shot a hart, a red deer stag, with bows and arrows in the wood of Arnold. The arrow was still in the animal when it was found. Hugh was hauled before the justices and thrown in prison. These weren't faceless statistics, they were named people, dragged through a real court for killing one deer. And in the harshest years under the early Norman kings, the punishments were brutal for what they were punishing. For killing a deer to feed your family, a commoner could be blinded, could lose a hand, could be put to death. The message behind it was total. This meat is worth more than your body. And here's the part that shows you exactly what medieval justice was really about. Over time, the law softened. By 1244, King Henry III had turned poaching into, on paper, a matter of fines. But the fines fell on the poor. Bishops and dukes caught poaching were routinely let off without paying a thing. The same act, killing the same deer, was a fine you could ignore if you were rich and a life-destroying crime if you were poor. This is why, out of exactly this injustice, the countryside started telling stories about an outlaw who hunted the king's deer and gave it to the hungry. We call him Robin Hood. Now, I have to be honest about the edges of this. We know far more about what the rich ate than the poor because the rich kept accounts, feast menus, household roles, careful records of every swan and boar. The peasant's meal mostly went unwritten. What we know about it, we reconstruct from manor records, from the food residues left in old pottery, from the bones in rubbish pits, and from the laws that tell us what people weren't allowed to do, which is its own kind of evidence. And the details varied enormously by king and century. The worst mutilations belonged mostly to the early Norman period. After Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest in the early 1200s, execution and blinding for forest crimes were formally abolished, and most poachers faced prison or fines. Enforcement was always patchier than the law pretended, but the shape of it is solid. The best meat was fenced off by power, the poor lived on cheese and pottage, and the parts of the animal nobody else wanted, and the gap between the two plates was the whole social order, served at dinner. So go back to that chicken you can buy for the price of a coffee. The whole animal, any cut you want, no permission required, no law watching the tree line. For almost all of history, that would have been unthinkable. Not because meat was scarce, but because meat was controlled. The deer in the forest, the boar in the woods, the swan on the water, the best of everything went to people who ate it for pleasure while a peasant boiled the feet and the blood and the parts they threw away. The animals were right there, grazing 10 feet from the door. And the difference between the man who could take one and the man who could lose his hand for it wasn't hunger. It was power. We turned meat back into just food. For most people who ever lived, it was never only that.